program is provided without charge by Reformed Theological Seminary, which reserves all rights. To learn how you can support RTS, please visit give.rts.edu.
All right, let's talk about heretical books. On your sheet there is just the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter, but I'm going to add some as we go, because I think it's important for you to know kind of what goes on in the world of apocryphal writings in early Christianity. Let's start with these apocryphal Gospels, and then we'll look at a couple of other things. Gospel of Thomas. Little doubt that Thomas is the best-known apocryphal Gospel and probably the best-known apocryphal writing in all of the modern world. Many people have, I would say most have heard of it. I would say some have read it. Regardless, it is a major fascination for modern readers. The discovery of the Gospel of Thomas is pretty interesting. It's actually discovered by Muhammad Ali, in case you're wondering. Of course, not the boxer. Muhammad Ali, the shepherd, in 1945, was near a little town called Nag Hammadi. Okay, the town's still there, little sort of farming area. So Nag Hammadi, Egypt. I don't know about you, but that just sounds like a place that you would find apocryphal material. Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a shepherd by the name of Muhammad Ali and his brother Sharif Ali were out digging for fertilizer sort of by this rock cliff. And they hit something hard with their shovel. This is like something out of a movie, but it's a true story. And they clear away all the dirt, and sure enough, they've got an earthenware jar, fairly sizable. It's sealed at the top, which is not unusual in the ancient world to do that. Like, what do we do with this? Well, obviously, if you find something in the ground and you're a poor shepherd in 1945 Egypt, you're thinking, there could be treasure in here. So no doubt, Muhammad Ali was thinking, okay, there's probably treasure in here. He's about ready to break it open. His brother says, don't break it. It could be an evil genie in there that'll come out and curse us. So literally they had the debate about whether to open it, fear the evil genie, or leave it like it was. And of course, the lure of gold was too much. So they broke it open and were grandly disappointed. I mean, imagine you're thinking you're going to find gold. You open up, there's a bunch of books. Now, of course, what they didn't realize, actually they found gold beyond their wildest dreams, but they didn't know it. And so they found what you have in there is, they didn't realize at the time, but they found basically 13 codices, which included in them 52 separate tractates or books. This was a library of sorts, and it was a rather hodgepodge kind of library. There's all kinds of different works in here. Even Plato is in here. Okay, so you got secular works, it's a variety of sort of Christian works, but universally throughout this collection is a theme of what you might call Gnostic works. Okay. Now, Gnosticism is a tricky term. In my Hebrews of Rev class, I talk about Gnosticism, and Gnosticism is a very hard thing to pin down in terms of what Gnostics really believe. There's a lot of variety of them. Some have even suggested there's no such thing as Gnosticism, and that Gnosticism is just a scholarly construct that people made up. But nonetheless, there is a sense in which Gnostics believe in certain things. And what's interesting about the Nag Hammadi codices, it wasn't just Gnosticism, it was what was called basically Valentinian Gnosticism. And Valentinian Gnosticism was known for having a creation myth. The story of creation that you know from Genesis is not the story of creation that is in the Valentinian Gnostic thought. They believe that the God that created this world was one of many gods. So they're polytheists. A great emanation of different layers of divine beings out from the main being, what are called eons, right? Or aeons, depending on how you spell it. These little aeons come out as emanations from the divine being, and they're all their own little divine entities. And then one of those broke away, rebelled, and they created the physical world that you know as the world you live in. But differently, Valentinian Gnostics believe that the God that created the physical world you're in is an evil God, okay? Is a wicked God, is a bad God. When you read the Old Testament, therefore, what are you reading? The story of the bad God. One of many gods. So they reject the God of the Old Testament. They reject the Old Testament and the Old Testament God. Now I want you just to take that creation myth and run with it for a moment. If in fact you believe that the physical world is the creation of the demiurge, a false god, then what do you think about the physical world? You think it's bad, okay? In fact, that God broke the rules by creating a physical world and has trapped you in it. You are trapped in this physical world. Your spark of divinity in you is trapped in these physical things you call a body, in the flesh. And the job that you have is to be enlightened and to break away from the physical body, okay? Sort of Eastern mysticism sort of tied into this as well. So this is a rejection of the Old Testament God and the sort of the evil, fallen nature of the physical world. Evil nature of physical world. So a physical world is a problem. Now, take that whole creation myth, and what do they do with Jesus? Jesus is another divine being. Not the ultimate God, of course, but another divine being who comes in from the outside onto earth to save the day, to give you enlightenment, to release you from the false God of the Old Testament. Now, if you think that Jesus is a good God, one of the other emanations that comes into the world against the false God who made this world, do you think he became physical and took on a body? Well, of course you don't, because why would he then be bound to the same problem that you're bound to? Why would he take on a physical body when physical bodies are evil? That can't happen. So Jesus did not come in the flesh. Jesus did not come as a physical man. And so they tend to reject the physical world altogether. This is the Valentinian Gnostic myth. We could talk about this for quite a while. I talk about it a little bit in Hebrews to Rev. Here's the point. Most of the documents in the Nag Hammadi collection fit this confessional stance, okay? And so documents like the Gospel of Truth, okay, which is going to have this vibe. Documents like the Gospel of Philip is going to have this same sort of vibe. The Apocryphon of James is going to have this vibe. There's all these other very weird, these are weird books, okay? The Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Truth, when you read it, you think it's a gospel. It doesn't sound like a gospel at all. All the Gospel of Truth is a long, rambling, bizarre look at the creation myth. And you're like, why does it name gospel? But that's just the name of it. It's called the Gospel of Truth. The Gospel of Truth was probably written by Valentinius himself. Okay, and all these 52 tractates, sort of at the center, at least in people's attention, is the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas has emerged as one of the most interesting of them, and there's probably lots of reasons why that's the case. What you may not realize is that the Gospel of Thomas was actually discovered before Nag Hammadi. Do you know what the very first papyri from Oxyrhynchus was? P. Oxy 1? The Gospel of Thomas. Did you know that? P. Oxyrhynchus 1, and then a couple others, I think it's 654 and 655, I can't remember. 3 early papyri were these weird sayings of Jesus, and no one knew what they were. They didn't have a name for them, they didn't understand them, and they found these in the Oxyrhynchus papyri, and they were just floating around out there with no identity. And then, in 1945, when they discovered the Nag Hammadi documents, they realized, wait a second, when I read the Gospel of Thomas in the Nag Hammadi documents, that sounds like P. Oxyrhynchus 1 and 654 and 655. We've read this before. So part of the reason that Thomas was capturing the imagination is because we actually had earlier versions of it. Very fragmentary, but earlier versions of it. Now, the copy at Nag Hammadi of Thomas was written in Coptic, okay? And it was basically a complete version of it. The original versions of Thomas that we found at Oxyrhynchus were written in Greek, but very fragmentary. Now, what did the Coptic version say? Well, the Coptic version, as you know, isn't really a story of Jesus at all. It's also not a narrative of any sorts. It's not a death and resurrection story. The Nag Hammadi Gospel of Thomas, that was all in Coptic, was basically a list of 114 sayings of Jesus. 114 sayings of Jesus where Jesus says this, and then Jesus says that. Jesus says this, and then Jesus says that. It just goes on and on for 114 of these. Now, this means, of course, that the Gospel of Thomas doesn't have any of the typical birth story, death story, resurrection story, ascension story, none of it. It's just sayings. Now, as I have talked about in my Gospels class, scholars have used this framework of Thomas to do crazy things with it. They say, well, because it's just a sayings gospel, it must be dated really early. So they try to date it into the 1st century because it's just a list of sayings. That hasn't worked, but people have tried. They tried to argue that if it's dated to the 1st century, that the earliest layers of Christianity didn't care about Jesus' death and resurrection. Things like this, which, again, isn't met with much success in terms of being followed. But nonetheless, Thomas is this very odd gospel. What is interesting about the Gospel of Thomas is how much critical scholarship loves it. They think it's this refreshing, better version of Christianity as opposed to Orthodox Christianity. And scholars like Elaine Pagels at Princeton, who've written the book, The Gnostic Gospels, says that this is the version of Christianity that, in essence, she wishes were true or thinks is true. I mean, it's better than the version that we have in our canonical Gospels. What's interesting, though, is the very last saying in the Gospel of Thomas, which most of you probably have heard of. It's very weird. The saying 114 is, and this is just paraphrasing, but we could dig it up and read it if we wanted to. Basically, saying 114 says, every woman that makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven. So sorry to our ladies here. According to the Gospel of Thomas, every woman who makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, it's odd for a feminist scholar like Elaine Pagels to love the Gospel of Thomas when you've got a very non-egalitarian, non-pro-feminist statement at the end of the Gospel of Thomas that seems very unusual. I probably told you the story, but if I haven't, I'm going to tell it again anyway. Years ago, I used to take my Gospels class to hear critical scholars come to Charlotte and speak. And so it was at Myers Park Baptist, which is in downtown, well, Myers Park, Charlotte, not really downtown, but it's a lefty Baptist church, kind of way off the reservation, and they invite scholars from the Jesus Seminary in, and they've had everyone there, John Dominic Crossan, Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman, and so on. And they used to have these Friday night lectures with these people, open to the public. So I used to take my Gospels class every year. 30 or 40 of us, and we'd go and we'd sit in and we'd listen to this lecture. So one year we went, it was Elaine Pagels from Princeton. And of course, what's she speaking on? Here's a real shocker, the Gospel of Thomas. So she gives this long lecture on the Gospel of Thomas. And we're all sitting in this sort of block, right? It's a church. So there's like 30 of us all in this one section. So we're kind of obvious in this section. So it's Q&A time. So sure enough, it's Q&A time. So I don't remember what student was sitting next to me, and I just sort of nudged him. I said, ask a question. He's like, what are you talking about? And he goes, ask a question. He goes, well, I don't know what to ask. I was like, I'll tell you what to ask. And so he raises his hand, and Elaine Pagels calls on him for the first question. And I was like, this is great. So I whisper in his ear the question. So he stands up. I'm like feeding these guys questions, He stands up. He says, thank you, Dr. Pagels, for your lecture. Could you tell us, please, what you think of saying 114 in the Gospel of Thomas and how that fits into your view of Jesus? Sits down. You could tell that is not the question she wanted. And she goes, because she didn't mention it the whole time. It's fascinating. I don't know how you talk about the Gospel of Thomas and not talk about the last saying, especially when it says what it says. So she hems and haws, blah, blah, blah. Well, and so here's her answer. This was stunning. I can't believe she said this. I wish I had it on tape. Maybe it's on tape, but this is what she said. She goes, well, I don't think that verse was originally in the Gospel of Thomas, was her answer. In other words, I would like to think, no evidence for this, that it wasn't originally there and that it was added on at a later time, and I don't like it, so therefore it must be added in. She didn't say it that way, but that's in essence the impression you got, is that here's an inconvenient verse, I'm just going to claim it was added later. Of course, we could ask, the student who I fed the question to couldn't have done the follow-up, but there's no evidence for that anywhere, okay, anywhere. The only evidence we have is that this is the 114th saying in the Gospel of Thomas. The idea that an early version didn't have it, simply zero evidence for it, wishful thinking. This is an example of what we're talking about, is that you have to reconfigure the Gospel of Thomas to make it be what you want it to be if you're going to end up liking it as some sort of alternate version of Christianity. Now, the dating of Thomas, as I said, has gone all over the map, but the consensus now, and has been for a long time, is Thomas probably a mid-2nd century production. We know this for 100 reasons I can't get into, in terms of what it's dependent on, the language it uses, the way it's dependent on the canonical Gospels, and more importantly, the flavor of Gnosticism in Thomas did not even exist until the 2nd century. So you can't have a 1st century Thomas doing what Thomas is doing, because it doesn't fit at all the 1st century. It's a 2nd century text. So if it's a 2nd century text, then it couldn't have been written by an apostle. So it's heretical, late, non-apostolic, docetic. Well, no, really not docetic. That's more Peter, but at least has Gnostic flavors to it. And it comes in this cachet of text from Nag Hammadi. This is why we don't think the Gospel of Thomas is canonical. No one really thought the Gospel of Thomas is canonical. And this is why Irenaeus doesn't even put it in the first 3 steps. It's banished to Never Never Land out there, right? And the 4th layer, and suitably so. Now, let me mention 2 books by some scholars on this. The 2 recent books on Thomas, if you want to do more on this, is Simon Gather-Cole at Cambridge. He just wrote a book on Thomas that pretty much makes the same argument I did. And then the guy at Duke, Mark Goodacre. Mark Goodacre and Simon Gather-Cole both written books on Thomas recently, and they both came out about the same time. I guess if you're a scholar and you're doing that kind of work, that's kind of a bummer. They both came out at the same time, but they reached almost exactly the same conclusions. Duke scholar, Cambridge scholar, and that is Thomas is definitively not 1st century, but 2nd century and dependent on the canonical Gospels. Which, incidentally, one of the things you'll note about apocryphal Gospels is they almost always show dependence on the canonical 4. And if they're doing that, if they're borrowing from the canonical four, then what does that tell you? That tells you that they're late, that they're after the fact. All right, we're moving our way through the heretical books. Let's move on to the Gospel of Peter. This is also one of the most well-known apocryphal Gospels. And with names like Thomas and Peter, you can see the trend here amongst many of them, which is the name after apostles. As we already indicated, this is not unusual and a pretty common tactic. If you wanted to get a hearing for your book, it makes sense that you would name it after someone famous. The most clear example we have of the Gospel of Peter on a manuscript level actually comes from an 8th century manuscript, which is a manuscript discovered in a tomb, interestingly. And it seems to be at least a section of the Gospel of Peter. We also have earlier fragments, but they're disputed. They could be the Gospel of Peter, they're in Greek, but there's a lot of conversation among scholars about whether they are the Gospel of Peter or not. Regardless, the Gospel of Peter is noteworthy for a couple reasons. One is, the Gospel of Peter is very different than the Gospel of Thomas in one real obvious way, and that is it's a narrative gospel. It actually tells you something about what Jesus did. And in this sense, it tells you about his death and resurrection. So whereas the Gospel of Thomas isn't a narrative gospel at all, but simply a series of sayings, the Gospel of Peter is a narrative gospel that is quite willing to talk about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that's noteworthy. But here's what's interesting, is the Gospel of Peter, when it tells the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus, fills in a number of the gaps left by the canonical Gospels. It embellishes the story of the canonical Gospels. It's dependent on the canonical Gospels, but then, more importantly, actually adds things where the Gospels leave them silent or blank. And incidentally, this was very common amongst apocryphal material. One of the main ways we can tell something's apocryphal is that you look at the gaps left by the canonical Gospels, and suddenly these apocryphal Gospels are filling in the gaps. You kind of get the idea. They're writing what you would wonder about that wasn't there. And the example of the Gospel of Peter is a really good one, because what the Gospel of Peter does, and if you think about this, this is true, no other gospel does, and that is the Gospel of Peter shows you the resurrection actually happening. When you read the canonical Gospels, if you maybe this never dawned on you, but when you read the canonical Gospels, do you notice they never actually show the resurrection? All they show is arrival when it's over. The women show up at the tomb in the morning, it's already happened. Stones rolled away, Jesus isn't there. Whatever happened at the resurrection, you don't see Jesus coming out of the tomb at the resurrection. He isn't there. He's already gone when you arrive. Now, pausing on that for a moment, this is a stunning example of restraint amongst the canonical gospel authors. I mean, if you're writing the story of Jesus and his resurrection, and you wanted to convince your audience about how wonderful it was and how beautiful it was and powerful and great, wouldn't you position someone as an eyewitness to it? Wouldn't you actually show it happening? Wouldn't you record what took place? And that'd be pretty compelling, but what's interesting is the gospel authors do none of this. They simply, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they simply show you after the fact the tomb already empty. Now, this is, I think, evidence of the canonical gospel's authenticity. It's a sign of literary restraint, okay? They're telling it as it is. There's a sense of soberness and simplicity to the canonical gospels, where they're not giving you the expected, embellished, over-the-top account. Not so with Peter. Peter actually shows you the resurrection happening. He shows you Jesus coming out of the tomb. But here's what's interesting. When he shows you Jesus coming out of the tomb, it's not like you would think. When Peter shows Jesus come out of the tomb, he's not normal Jesus, he's giant Jesus. When Jesus comes out of this tomb, he's enormous, he's huge. His head reaches to the clouds, according to the Gospel of Peter. What I call him Godzilla Jesus, right, coming out of the Gospel of Peter. So here's Jesus coming out of the tomb. He's superhuman, super huge, big. His head reaches to the cloud. He's flanked by an angel on either side. It's a dramatic scene. Big, giant Jesus coming out of the tomb. But as if that's not bizarre enough, the Gospel of Peter adds something else on it that's rather odd, is that following Jesus out of the tomb is the cross itself. We don't know, first of all, how the cross got in the tomb. There's no record that Romans would bury people with the cross, so that's bizarre. But you have the cross following Jesus out of the tomb. We don't know how that's happening. Is it floating? Is the cross walking? We don't know what's happening, but it's following Jesus out of the tomb. That's strange. And then it gets even stranger after all this. The cross starts to talk, starts to speak. So you got a floating, talking cross following giant Jesus out of the tomb in the Gospel of Peter. Now, on one level, you get your wish. You get to see the resurrection happening, and it's pretty exciting, I suppose, if you're into this sort of thing in the 2nd century and you want an embellished literary story to be excited about. The problem is it's over the top, bizarre, and strange, and clearly filling in the gaps left by the canonical Gospels. On top of this, though, is the theological implications of it. In the Gospel of Peter, you can't just note that Jesus has this sort of weird body when he comes out of the tomb. What you want to note is why he has a big, giant body coming out of the tomb. Or probably the better way to say it is, why does he not seem to have a body at all? And the answer is because scholars are fairly convinced, and there's dispute about this, but for our purposes here, we'll just note the consensus view. There's a pretty established view is that the Gospel of Peter holds to a theological position known as Docetism. Now, Docetism is the view that Jesus was not actually physical. He was not actually a human being in the way you and I are, but he only appeared to be human. He only seemed to be human. So his humanness was an illusion. His humanness was fake, okay? It was a front. Sure, if you visited with Jesus and talked with him, he would seem human. He'd appear to be human, but he wasn't really human. Now, why do you think someone would have a view like that in the ancient world? Well, it follows right from Valentinian Gnosticism we just talked about. If the physical world is evil, God can't take on a human flesh, so he's going to try to relate to humans, so he's going to appear to be human but not. And so you have a Gnostic version of things here where there's no way that a Gnostic is going to have Jesus actually physical. So they have this Docetic view where Jesus isn't physical at all. This comes out another place in the Gospel of Peter. When Jesus is being nailed to the cross in the Gospel of Peter, it tells us that as he was nailed to the cross, it's almost like he didn't feel any pain. It didn't hurt him. This is probably indicative, again, of a Docetic strain within this particular gospel. It's also interesting what Jesus says on the cross when he dies in the Gospel of Peter. Here he is, feeling no pain, but he cries out, my power, why have you forsaken me?" Now, this is a little bit of an oddity here in the Gospel of Peter. It's hard to tell what kind of Christology Peter has. Is it Docetic, so Jesus appears to be human, or there's what's also known in Gnostic circles as a separationist Christology. Separationist Christology within Gnosticism, and it also occurred in other areas, is this idea that Jesus was a normal human being that a divine spirit took over. And then before Jesus died, that divine spirit left. Okay? So here's a man named Jesus who's maybe extra holy, and he gets taken over by a divine spirit called the Christ, and he becomes Jesus Christ. Jesus was the man part, Christ is the divine part. A spirit sort of inhabits him, uses him to accomplish amazing things, and then right before he dies, that spirit, that power leaves. That's very much a Gnostic idea. Well, you can see how that might also be in play here as possible explanation for this, is that this power leaves him right before he dies. Regardless, this pretty much explains Serapian's reaction. Remember our story of Serapian, talking about the church at Rosas, who was reading the Gospel of Peter? As soon as he read it, he's like, wow, this is awful. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out, right? You're like, this is embellished, it's legendary, it's weird, it's obviously Docetic or a separationist. Something's going on here with this, and so you can see why he condemns it as spurious and not to be read by the church. So this is, the Gospel of Peter. What do we know about its production then? Well, what we know is that it's probably a 2nd century text of some sort. Just like the Gospel of Thomas, we don't know who wrote it, but it's probably written somewhere in the 2nd century and is not to be considered apostolic in any way and reflects very much the kind of theological debates that were going on during this time period. The Gospel of Peter is one of those things that most people haven't read. Has anyone here read the Gospel of Peter? Not heard about it, but read it? That's pretty standard. Most people probably heard of Thomas and maybe read Thomas, but Peter's, again, down the road, not a usual gospel. All right, now, not in your notes, I'm going to take you on a little tour of some other apocryphal texts. We're going to look at other kinds of apocryphal texts. I'm just going to run through some other examples for you. So we're going to break this down into sections. These are all apocryphal works: Gospels, Epistles, Acts, and Apocalypses. Now, one thing that is worth observing here, and this is to some extent, something that's not necessarily good, but we've got to get our mind around it, is that in the Christian world, there were a number of groups that like to produce texts like this, right? And they really started in the 2nd century. Christians in the 2nd century were prolific producers of texts, and apocryphal texts were very common. And many of them were in the names of people that didn't write them. So this is one of those, kind of complicated things we just got to deal with. Of course, a lot of these are written by fringe groups, right? Heretical groups that we think already have a lot of problems. So, you don't find the Orthodox group doing much of this, although there are exceptions where even Orthodox people find themselves tied up into things. So we're gonna run through a few examples of this and just say a few words about each, and I think it's helpful for you to just get a lay of the land. So under the Gospels, let's just walk through some of these. We're going to start with the Gospel of Mary. Now, the Gospel of Mary is a fascinating text. It's Gnostic too. And it also does not include the standard events in the life of the historical Jesus like the Gospel of Peter or anything like that. What the Gospel of Mary is what we call a post-resurrection dialogue. There's a bunch of these. Okay? A post-resurrection dialogue is a record of secret teachings of Jesus after he rose from the dead. You can see why people would be interested in passing along these secret teachings, because if you're writing an apocryphal work, okay, and you're trying to teach things that no one's learned before, that false teachings, you want to find a place in Jesus' life when he could have delivered them secretly. Okay, see, look, this is when Jesus really taught these things. That's why you didn't read about these in the canonical Gospels. And so one of the favorite places for this is Jesus' time after the resurrection. This is another example of filling in the gaps. So I want you to think about the canonical Gospels for a moment. How much information do we have about the time, and Jesus apparently spent a good bit of time with his disciples after the resurrection. How much do we have in the canonical Gospels? Hardly anything. Hardly anything. We've got the appearances, road to Emmaus, in the upper room. We've got a very brief ascension scene or final scene in Matthew with the Great Commission, and a version of it in Luke. Not really anything in Mark because of the long ending problem. In John, you've got that story of the fish, right? And feed my sheep. But these are snippets. There's not a lot there. Theoretically, Jesus said a lot of things we don't know about during this time period, right? Is that exhaustively capture all that he did? No, because he was on earth for many days after this. So you can see what apocryphal Gospels are doing here. They're saying, oh, wait a second, we can start filling in the gaps. This is that theme I told you about, where this is what they like to do. Gospel of Mary is one of these. So the Gospel of Mary records conversations between Jesus and his disciples after the resurrection prior to his ascension. But there's a new player in the game, and that's Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is part of the conversation. And Jesus even seems to favor her to some extent. And the disciples even start complaining, why does he prefer her over us? Now, if you've read the Da Vinci Code, even if you haven't, this is a sort of a theme amongst sort of fringe texts, and then in the Da Vinci Code is this sort of supposed relationship between Jesus and Mary. Did he have a wife? Was it Mary Magdalene? And this sort of thing. Well, you can see how texts like this kind of feed the fire. Now, it doesn't say that this was that Mary was Jesus' wife, or they had any kind of romantic relationship, but you can see how this starts getting the ball rolling on that, especially when it's Mary versus the rest of the 12 in a gospel like this. So feminists love the Gospel of Mary, right? It's like vindication. Here's Jesus kind of trusting a woman over the 12. Now, of course, Mary didn't have this sort of role in the Gospels. She was an important figure, but not the kind of thing that the Gospel of Mary brings up. What's interesting, though, is that in the modern day, people have started giving Mary roles that just don't fit. So I'll give you an example of this. There's a Jesus video called The Gospel of John, which I actually happen to like. There's 100 movies of Jesus out there, and they all have their little angles. Well, 10 years ago, there was one called The Gospel of John that came out. Maybe you saw it, right? And what's unique about this Jesus movie is it's just John. Most of the Jesus movies, as you know, try to mesh them all together. It's like a Tatian diatessaron in film, right? You got to go from Matthew to Luke to John. They try to mash it all in there. Well, the Gospel of John film just solves that by just saying, we're just going to do John, okay? Give us a break. We're not doing Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're going to run John's narrative straight down the way. Okay, fair enough. So they do that. And you know something? The movie is really accurate. It's actually well done. They follow the narrative almost line by line, word by word, scene by scene. And I'm like, I'd let my kids watch this. Because you're getting the Bible, displayed faithfully. It's not got some weird agenda. So I'm watching the Gospel of John, fairly pleased, and then it gets to the scene in the upper room in the Last Supper. I'm watching this, and it's just the 12 in the canonical accounts, including John. And all of a sudden I realize there's a woman there. And as I look at the film, I'm like, what? And I rewind it, and I'm looking around, and I figure out, based on little clues here and there, she's kind of in the background along the side helping him out. It's Mary Magdalene. I'm like, thinking to myself, how do you get Mary Magdalene at the Last Supper in a book or in a movie that's supposedly following the Gospel of John to the T? It's not there in the text. It's not anywhere in the text. Where do you get that? So there's a sense in which I was a little frustrated with that. Nonetheless, the Gospel of Mary is popular. There's other things about the Gospel of Mary we could say. One of the things that's interesting is it has that Gnostic flavor to it. It points people to the divine spark within, which is standard Gnostic stuff. Okay, this other example here. We're going to move, relatively quickly through these. Gospel of Judas. I talked about the Gospel of Judas offhand a little while ago. Gospel of Judas is a relatively recently discovered gospel, but it's old. We know that it dates back to the 2nd century, about the same time as the Gospel of Mary. By the way, one more comment on the Gospel of Mary before I mention it. You know that no church father ever mentions the Gospel of Mary, ever? We didn't even know the Gospel of Mary existed until we found a couple manuscripts, which is just an interesting side note. It's just not used much. No one ever talked about it. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Gospel of Judas. It, like the Gospel of Mary, also covers none of the standard moments in Jesus' life, but is another post-resurrection dialogue. This time, though, the main player is Judas. So just like the Gospel of Mary was Jesus, the disciples, and Mary, she's the foil, this is Jesus, the disciples, and Judas. And there's this secret Gnostic-like revelation given to Judas. And Judas, in one sense, kind of in a bizarre way, almost becomes the favored hero of the story. And it's hard to know exactly how to think of this because there's different opinions about the Gospel of Judas, but in some sense, he's given secret revelations, which is standard Gnostic fare in this dialogue. And it's almost like Jesus and Judas were pals, and Judas sort of worked to help Jesus get crucified because that was part of his mission. Okay, third example here. Just giving you the lay of the land. Gospel of Truth. I mentioned this a moment ago. This was discovered at the Nag Hammadi collection. It is not at all a narrative gospel. In fact, it's not even really remotely a gospel about Jesus at all. Instead, it's just a theological treatise. And in this theological treatise, it tells about the Gnostic myth of creation and all the different sort of Valentinian philosophies and so on. It seems more like a sermon or a theological work, and has some moral application and doctrinal discussions, but it's just not, Jesus isn't in it. I mean, he's in it, but not in it as a story of his life. This has got nothing to do with his life, and so it's a really weird gospel that is worth noting. Let me mention also what are called Jewish Christian Gospels. Jewish Christian Gospels are their own entity, and there's a slew of these. And it's very complicated, but Jewish Christian Gospels are Gospels that somehow seem associated with Jewish Christian groups. There's a number of different Jewish Christian groups circulating in early Christianity. I'll mention a couple here. One of them is called the Ebionites. The Ebionites believe that you should still keep the law to be saved. They didn't believe in the divinity of Jesus and things like that. There's another Jewish group called the Nazarenes. They seem to be more orthodox, but still very Jewish Christian in their practices and so on. What's interesting is apparently they had Gospels. And there's examples of these Gospels. One of them is called the Gospel of the Hebrews. One of them is called the Gospel of the Nazarenes. One of them is called the Gospel of the Ebionites. Here's what's interesting about Jewish Christian Gospels, though, is we don't know if these are the same Gospel with different names, if they overlap, are they versions of each other. They seem like Matthew in some ways, but in other ways they don't. It's a very complex world. But here's what's interesting about it, is we don't possess any manuscripts of these. This is an example of Gospels that we know exist because the church fathers refer to them, but we don't actually have them. So we have Mary, we have Judas, we have the Gospel of Truth, admittedly, some of this in fragmentary forms. We don't have the Jewish Christian Gospels. Boy, if we did, that would be very interesting on a historical level. So what do we know about the Jewish Christian Gospels? All we know about what's in them is what patristic authors cite. So they quote them, they refer to them, but they don't actually We don't actually have them. And this is an important category for what we're talking about. And because, there's a lot of Gospels like this, but this is just one of the main examples of them. Now, the other category, and this is the last category of Gospels we'll talk about here, is what we may call fragmentary. Fragmentary Gospels are small pieces of papyrus or parchment that have a gospel story on them that comes from nowhere else and that we just know. They don't have names necessarily, but we just know about them from archaeological discoveries. And so they're not like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Thomas. They're basically isolated texts. And this is important to know. Let me give you a couple examples of this. One is what's called Papyrus Egerton II. Papyrus Egerton II is famous for this simple reason. It might be the earliest gospel text we have of any kind. Now, the only thing that beats it here is P52, which is probably about 125 AD. But Papyrus Egerton II is an apocryphal gospel dated around 150. That date's been challenged lately, but I'm not going to get into that here. So it's dated around 150. The fragment's dated to around 150, which is shockingly early. The gospel has 5 stories of Jesus that aren't from the Bible, but they sound very much like they come from either John or the Synoptics or a mix thereof. And scholars have concluded that the P. Egerton II is probably built off of or copying or modifying or extrapolating on canonical stories, which is why it was probably produced somewhere in the early 2nd century, but we can't be sure. Another example of a fragmentary apocryphal gospel is the one I did work on, Oxyrhynchus 840. In fact, when I was planning my doctoral dissertation and looking for different aspects of the topic I was writing about, I knew I wanted to write in the area of Canon, but that's obviously way too broad, so you got to narrow it down. And so I was doing surveys of all these apocryphal works, and I actually read a whole dissertation at Egerton II and found fascinating. I was like, well, I wonder what else is out there. So I'm in the library one day in Edinburgh, down in the stacks, looking at stuff. And I don't even know how I found this, but I came across this volume published in 1908, very thin, old, not very big. And I pulled it out, and the title was A Fragment of an Unknown Gospel. Okay, got my attention. Looked at the date, 1908, and I began to read, and it was about Oxyrhynchus 840. And I'd never even heard of this thing. Here I am, a doctoral student. I'd heard about a lot of things I thought, but I'd never even heard of it. I didn't even know it existed. So I'm reading it. It was discovered in 1905, little miniature codex. You saw the picture earlier. It's a story of Jesus in the temple with the disciples, not obviously in the canonical Gospels. And he does a little analysis of it. This thing was by scholars by the name of Grenfell and Hunt, who were the original edition writers who discovered the Gospel. And they talked about where they thought it was from and what it meant and its orientation, the date and handwriting and all this. And I was like, this is fascinating. So I figured, okay, there's probably been 100 books on this. So as an interest point, I said, well, I'm going to see how much has been written on this. 1908 was the publication I had in my hand, but I was like, I wonder how much has been done. So I started doing research. As I started doing research, I realized there's nothing on this. No full-length works, no dissertation, hardly anything. In fact, there was a flurry of articles in 1908, mostly in German, maybe a couple more in like 1914, 1920, and then nothing for a while, one spattering in 1963, and then something in 1984, and that was it. None of these are books. I was like, bingo, all the lights are going on, right? I'm like, this is a great doctoral dissertation. You got something that was discovered, no one's done anything with it, so this is a fragmentary gospel. And so there's a bunch of these, by the way. I'm not giving you other examples. There's 1240, which is interesting, or is it 1220? I can't remember. This is a interesting fragment, too, of Jesus. Most of these are very small. Egerton II and Oxyrhynchus 840 are the biggest versions of this, and which is why I picked it. Now, before we leave Gospels, I'm going to mention one last category, and that is what are known as infancy Gospels. So notice all the different categories. You've got sort of post-resurrection dialogues. You've got these weird Valentinian Gnostic myth Gospels, Jewish Christian Gospels, fragmentary Gospels, and then now infancy Gospels. So let me say a word about infancy Gospels. Infancy Gospels are their own category. We have a whole number of these in ancient Christianity. And the rationale for these is exactly what you might expect. How much have you ever personally wondered what it was like to know Jesus as a child? Okay. What would it have been like to grow up knowing Jesus? What was he like as a kid? Did he ever get spanked, right? What was his family life like? How did he interact with his other siblings? How often did his siblings hear the line, "Why can't you be more like your brother Jesus?" Or something like this. I mean, we wonder these things, and notice the canonical Gospels don't tell you much about this. In fact, they're kind of eerily silent about it. You got Jesus born, a lot of detail there in the Gospels. And then you got Jesus pop on the scene, roughly age 30 with John the Baptist, a lot of detail there in the rest of his ministry. And then, needless to say, when you read the Gospels, you're like, well, what happened in the middle? There's only one text that tells us, right? The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus as a boy in the temple is that one little snippet to sort of whet our appetite for what Jesus' childhood was like. But then after that, you don't have anything, okay? So you can see once again, the theme I'm telling you here is that apocryphal texts fill in the gaps. And so we have a slew of what are called infancy Gospels. Now, I'm convinced that these are a lot like the apocryphal Acts, which we'll get to in a moment, where I think they're kind of legendary texts that entertain people, okay? It's hard to know how seriously to take them. But these infancy Gospels are all over the place. Let me just mention a couple here that are worth noting. The most popular was the Proto-Evangelium of James. Let me just write that down. This is an elaborate, sort of embellished gospel that talks about Jesus just after his birth, in his life as a child. It sort of elaborates on the birth narratives by adding a bunch of detail in them. But here's what's interesting about the Proto-Evangelium of James, is that it's really not about Jesus at all. This is an early gospel that starts off talking about the birth narrative and adding a bunch of elaborate detail to it. But then it really spins off into a discussion of Mary. Okay, pretty soon Mary is the main character. And she's lauded and praised. And it's this book, if you're curious where this comes from, that sort of starts feeding the idea of a perpetual virginity for Mary. Because in the book, she's not only portrayed sort of as elevated status herself, but she's portrayed as someone who doesn't ever bear children after that, because she's perpetually a virgin forever. Now, this is a 2nd century text. It's very popular in early Christianity. What's interesting about it is that not only is there a perpetual virginity of Mary, but the Proto-Evangelium of James actually also mentions Mary's birth, which is near miraculous. You've heard about the Immaculate Conception, right? The Immaculate Conception in Roman Catholic theology is not a reference to Jesus' birth, but to Mary's. Okay, and this gets us all into her own quasi-virgin birth. Think about it for a moment. If you're going to argue for a sinless Jesus, sort of the Catholic theology just backs it up to sort of a sinless Mary, okay, that she was perpetually a virgin and born miraculously herself. Okay, well, that's okay, but then you just back that up. Well, how did she get born miraculously then? So it doesn't really solve the problem, but nonetheless, it creates this sort of aura around Mary that we don't find anywhere in the canonical text, or in the 1st century for that matter. This is an example of filling in the gaps. It's also an example of where a lot of Roman Catholic theology ended up sort of claiming originality. If you say no one in the early church believed some of these things about Mary, that's not true. Someone did. The author of the Proto-Evangelium, James, did. But there is no widespread sense that was a belief amongst early Christians that needs to be followed. Besides, I don't know if we'd want to stake any real doctrines on an apocryphal gospel. They may have some true things in there, but this gospel doesn't seem to have much positive things. The other one is probably more famous in popular culture, and which one is that? Yes, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Now, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is always confused with the Gospel of Thomas. So I'm going to help you right now. Don't make this mistake. Okay, people say Infancy Gospel of Thomas, Gospel, they just blur them all together. Two different books, okay? We already talked about the Gospel of Thomas. It's that 114 sayings found at Nag Hammadi and so on. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas is later, probably 3rd or 4th century. It is a legendary, and when I say legendary, I mean very legendary, embellished account of the boy Jesus and all his antics. And when I say antics, I mean antics. They talk about him as a child sort of torturing and tormenting his poor classmates in the village, and he's sort of this wild child, miraculous kid, wonder kid, who's zapping people and doing miracles, and he's frightening the town, and they don't know what to do with him. They can't control him. So, yeah, he's the Son of God as a kid, but not all what you hoped he would be, right? He's a little hellion, really, in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And so at one point, another child bumps into him and makes the boy Jesus mad, and he zaps him dead on the spot. And then, of course, when the town gets upset, he raises them from the dead, right? There's another famous scene where he's breaking the Sabbath by making these sort of mud birds, clay pigeon type things out of the ground. They come and confront him about his activity, and the boy Jesus turns the clay pigeons into real pigeons, and the evidence flies away, right? So he has this sort of very tenuous relationship with the village he is, and he's really a frightening, scary little kid. This is a great example of the speculation and bizarre nature of a lot of these Infancy Gospels. And honestly, rather entertaining to some extent. I mean, it's funny on one level and weird and scary. But the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is a strange, strange book. What it exposes here is the struggle that early Christians probably had in evaluating how to express Jesus' divinity, even though he was manifest in a human life. And this is not a struggle that only Gnostics or whoever wrote the Infancy Gospel of Thomas would share. This is a struggle that you and I share. I mean, how is it that God in the flesh was a child? I mean, what would that have looked like? You know, what do we do with that? And the answer is we don't know. We don't have all the information, but it does raise a very complicated question as you're trying to join together the divinity of Jesus and his humanity in a way that just is mind-boggling. And that's true, right? We struggle to figure out what that would be like. It's less problematic when he's an adult, more problematic when he's a kid. So this is what leads people to come up with all these strange theories about him as a child. Okay, this is our whirlwind tour of the apocryphal Gospels. This isn't all of them, certainly. There's more that can be said. I mean, we've got all kinds of other interesting things. We've got what are called the Pilate cycles, which is a very late sort of genre of apocryphal stories of Jesus, where it records dialogues between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. And as you can see, yet again, it fills in gaps left by the canonical Gospels. We get a little bit of interaction with Jesus and Pilate, but not much, and this fills it all in. There's a scene in the Pilate cycles where Jesus walks into the praetorium, and the Roman statues bow to him, you know, as a sign that he's really the Son of God. And of course, that's a legendary embellishment, but nonetheless interesting. And so we've got a ton more we could add here. But this is a tour, if you will, of the landscape of apocryphal material in early Christianity. The big century where this took place in terms of the beginning of it, the explosion of this kind of material is the 2nd century. Okay, probably somewhere around the middle of the 2nd century, this started happening. Now, the good news on our end, of course, is that by that time, the 4 Gospels were already well established as Scripture. And so what you've got is some of this other material getting created that is late to the game. Now, some of it may have some true things in it. You know, we talked about this. I mean, some of these are way off the reservation, you know, Infancy Gospel of Thomas. Others of these have a little more common sense to them. The thing that has probably the most potential for reliability is going to be some of these fragmentary Gospels. Edgerton 2 and 840 may have echoes of true things. And then up here, the Jewish Christian Gospels may have some echoes of true things. Obviously, you know, these are crazy. Gospel Judas, Gospel Mary, Gospel Truth, totally wacko. So you're probably getting most of your potential for truth either here or here in terms of them being mixed. Now, I didn't mention the other gospel, which I can't believe I didn't mention, is the gospel of Jesus' wife. So the gospel of Jesus' wife, and I'll just say a quick word about this and we'll move on. But you know that 5 years ago or whatever it was, a fragment was brought forth and given to Karen King at Harvard University, who is a early Christianity person, kind of like Elaine Pagels, does a lot of stuff in apocryphal materials and kind of feminist theology and things like this. And this particular fragment was tiny, it was small, it's about that big, and it had a few lines in Coptic on it. And one of those lines mentioned Jesus' wife, okay? Incidentally, this is the first time ever in any document anywhere that Jesus is said to have a wife. And you just need to know that. There's not a document anywhere in all of Christianity anywhere that says Jesus was married. Even though, you know, of course, Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code crew loves to talk about that. There's no historical evidence for it. But there's always been speculation about Jesus and Mary, right? And the reason is because of the Gospel of Mary, which we talked about before. There's also another gospel called the Gospel of Philip. I mean, remember, this isn't exhaustive, that has conversations about the way Jesus and Mary relate. So there's these things floating around. So this fragment shows up and was given to Karen King by this guy who said he bought it from someone else, okay, and that he had it, and He wanted to see if Karen King thought it was authentic. So they start doing an analysis of this. They end up dating the papyrus itself, probably between the 5th and 8th century. I can't remember, but the papyrus itself was very old. And the ink turned out to be the kind of mix that you would have in the ancient world. And so far, it looks like this thing could be authentic. When we say authentic, of course, it doesn't mean it's true. It just means it seems to be ancient. Okay? Remember that the term authentic there means different things. And then she started analyzing the handwriting. The handwriting on this was really odd. And it looked almost like it was painted on the manuscript. As you can imagine, people thought, this doesn't look right. And I think I mentioned in a prior lecture that when I saw it at first, I said, this doesn't look right. And I've actually blogged on my website about it a couple different times about different things about it that I find suspicious and confusing. But a number of Coptic experts jumped on to this manuscript. One of them was a good friend of mine, Christian Askeland, who's actually a guy that was at Cambridge, and now he's in America, was at Indiana Wesleyan, I believe, and I'm not sure where he is right now, but he's a Coptic scholar who was all over this, and they end up finding out that there's a mistake in the Coptic. The fact that there's a mistake in the Coptic wouldn't be unusual, but what's funny is that exact mistake occurs in a printed edition of the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic that was modern. And so what the argument is, and I think this is pretty convincing, is that there was a forger who basically crypted Coptic out of Thomas from a printed edition and forged this text. And the link there is really hard to miss. And you just don't have the statistical likelihood of that same mistake. And there's some other things that feed this in terms of word order and things that just looks like obviously they copied a modern edition of Thomas. Remember, it's Coptic, okay? And so the person probably was thinking, where can I get some Coptic words, Coptic language? Borrowed it from Thomas, stuck it in this gospel. So the controversy has been raging for 5 years, about whether this is authentic, not authentic. And, of course, Karen King has been digging in her heels about it, saying, well, we're not sure. It might still be authentic. The critics are saying, look, this is a forgery. We just need to admit it. And so back and forth. And you can see ideology plays a big part of this, right? Because someone like King is going to want Jesus to be portrayed as having a wife because it can shatter conceptions of Christianity and this, that, and the other. So fast forward to about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, an article comes out in The Atlantic, which is a very sort of well-known journalistic magazine. I think it's based out of New York. So they do pieces on a number of things. Is it D.C.? Okay, somewhere up there. It's a reputable publication. So they do different things. And apparently a journalist started investigating this manuscript about a year ago. And he just published this article. And I forget the guy's name. I blogged on this. But the journalist decided he was going to start doing some detective work on who the owner was. And I've got to tell you, at some point, if you haven't read the Atlantic piece on this, you're going to be blown away. It's one of the most amazing pieces of journalism I've seen in years. And most of the time when anyone in the world of journalism does something, I'm like, you guys are barking up the wrong tree here. You're wasting your time. You're biased. And this is the kind of stuff journalists should be doing. But this guy did. 95% of what journalists do isn't what they should be doing. This guy did great work. What he did is he investigated who the owner might be, which is what Karen King would never do. Okay? And so he went on I got to say, this is something out of a movie. He went on this crusade all over the world, to Germany, to Florida, he went to California. He went and interviewed people, tracked things down, did investigations. And I'm not going to be able to recap the whole thing, but here's what it turns out. He found out who the guy was that not only owned it, but likely forged it. And he's basically a sort of slick, shifty German businessman who's got questionable ethics from a lot of his back dealings with people, who, as a younger man, bombed out of a master's degree in Egyptology and Coptic. So he had some Coptic ability, some interest in ancient texts, and ended up immigrating to the United States in late 70s, early 80s, and ran some shady businesses here, and ended up probably forging this document and passing it off as authentic to Karen King. And this guy's journal article just blew the whole thing wide open. And it was so convincing and so powerful that when the article was over, King actually finally said, okay, it looks like it's a forgery. And she relented off her position. And now it's almost universally agreed that not only that it's a forgery, but this is the guy who forged it. Turns out also that the motivation behind this guy is that he and his wife, they're an odd pair, have a Da Vinci Code style fascination with Jesus being married and having a wife and this sort of thing. So, I mean, all the pieces come together on this. So here's what's fascinating about it, is that this is a forgery that should have been spotted, day one, but wasn't. And you can tell why, because if you want something to be true, you might find a way to make it true. Now, no doubt the forger was smart enough that if you're going to forge something, what are you going to forge it with? You're going to forge it on an ancient piece of papyrus, which, by the way, you can get easily. We have blank papyrus that you can just buy and get in lots of different sources of antiquity. So no doubt he got one of those and then found out what ancient ink was made of and did it that way. So when they did the carbon-14 dating on the papyrus, it ended up being old. But that doesn't mean the text is old, right? The text can be new. And so forgers who know a little bit about what they're doing can usually fool people. And this isn't the first time this has been done. There's other forgeries. You may have heard of the Secret Gospel of Mark, which is another forgery that I'm not going to get into today.
The preceding program has been brought to you by Reformed Theological Seminary and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.